Welcome to In Conversation with David Frum. I'm your host, Sean Spear, editor-at-large at The Hub. I'm glad to be back in conversation with David for another installment of our bi-weekly video and podcast series on the key issues concerning Canadian policy and politics. In today's conversation, we'll cover some of the big issues of the past week, including Donald Trump's ongoing threats to Canada, Mark Carney's Liberal leadership victory and his transition into being Prime Minister, and much, much more. David, thanks as always for joining me.
Well, these are tough times. We have to stick together.
Indeed. Before we get started, David, if you'll permit me, I'm excited to make an announcement. Given the unsettled times that we're living in and how much we've come to draw on your insights and wisdom to make sense of things, I'm pleased to report that for the next few months, In Conversation with David Frum will be released on a weekly rather than bi-weekly basis. I know our audience will be as pleased as I am about the news. So thank you so much, David, for agreeing to increase the number of times I get to talk to you each month.
I hope not to wear out my welcome, but thank you.
I want to start, David, with the extraordinary market reaction that we've seen to the Trump administration's policy chaos over the past week or so. Given that you're in D.C., why don't you just talk about the extent to which what's happening in the White House is starting to spill out into the broader economy?
Well, the Donald Trump, in Donald Trump's mind, it's forever 1977. And that's communicated to a lot of the people around him. They just don't understand how modern economies work. And let me give you an example of this. When J.D. Vance, Trump's running mate, was campaigning in favor of tariffs during the campaign, he talked about how we don't care we don't care how many cheap toasters we get.
Yeah,
we'll accept a million. I think he said 1 million cheap toasters are not worth one American job.
yes.
Now, as a matter of fact, I did the arithmetic on this. When toasters were American made back in the early 70s, a toaster cost about $1972.
Yeah.
Today, at Walmart, a toaster costs about $2025. So that's about a 90% reduction in the value of the toaster. So you get like $90 off per toaster times 1 million. That's 90 million. You're saying $90 million in improved welfare is not worth. What if you said to the guy who's in the toaster factory, tell you what, let's split this. You get half for the elimination of your toaster manufacturing job. But the real point of that story is they never mastered the idea that every product is a component inside another product.
Yeah.
So when you build, I was talking to someone who was doing some work in the auto industry, that the components, you buy a GM, Chrysler, Ford car, there are pieces in that car that have crossed the Mexican and Canadian border maybe 5 or even 6 times over the course of their life. You put a tariff on every one of those journeys. The whole project becomes impossible. And it isn't just that the car becomes expensive, it's that the just-in-time deliveries don't work. You have to have inventory. The whole thing just collapses.
Yeah.
And that's true of not just automobiles, but so many other components. Trump's also been talking about giving away American export markers for agricultural goods. Before Trump's first term, the United States was the largest exporter of soybeans on the planet. That's now Brazil, because China pivoted. And Trump explicitly said that other agricultural exporters had better get used to selling to the home market. Well, how much feed corn can the American home market sustain? How much wheat can Americans eat themselves? These are all export markets. And I think the financial markets had this idea that Trump was just gassing, that he was just blathering. He just said stupid things, and that there would be some Jerry Cohn figure like in the first term to reel him back and realize, no, he's surrounded by enablers this time. It's really happening. There are 2 other problems that he's got. One is in 2017, Trump was able to compensate from some of his other stupid economic ideas by giving a big tax cut.
Yes.
But that tax cut expires in 2025. To renew it, simply to renew the status quo, will take almost all the fiscal room and more that's available to the Trump administration. Any further stimulus would require deficits that are not only enormous, but that also would bust up the process in Congress for approving the deficits. So the financial markets are looking at some pretty grim realities. One more thing they're looking at is reductions in the labor force. And the Trump, good news, the Trump crackdown on immigration is looking to be quite effective. Bad news, the Trump crackdown on immigration is looking to be quite effective.
I want to take up your observations about competence, David, because whatever one thinks about the Trump administration, there was a sense in the early days after the inauguration, as it moved forward on a series of executive orders, that it had learned some of the lessons of the failures of the first administration. It seemed more capable at public administration, if nothing else. And it seems to me the experience of tariffs over the past couple of weeks have laid bare the underlying public administration incompetency at the heart of the Trump administration. What explains the difference between some of the actions we saw early on from the administration in different policy areas and the complete disaster that we've seen play out over the past couple of weeks on tariffs?
Well, I think they are more competent. I think that early perception was true. So in Trump won, Trump arrived and he was surprised that he won. He didn't have much of an agenda. He was surrounded by people who, to the extent he had an agenda, didn't agree with it and tried to stop it. And Trump himself got drawn into these absurd quarrels about the crowd size at his inauguration.
Yes.
This time around, Trump has had a clear agenda. He wants to sell out Ukraine, and he wants to start trade wars with the entire planet. And he has been quite effective at doing both. Now, the reason it seems incompetent, which is not really the right word, is those policies are bad policies. When you are effective at imposing tariffs, you get a financial market crash. In Trump 1, Trump would have talked a lot about tariffs, but nothing would have happened and the financial markets would have gone up. So you'd had less competence, but more success.
Interesting.
This time, Trump's really done it. There are massive new tariffs being applied to all kinds of partners. And he succeeded. He did it in an administratively competent way. He was not thwarted by, remember the story about Gary Cohn? This may or may not be a true story, but snatching off Trump's desk the executive order to cancel the U.S.-South Korea free trade agreement. Whether that happened or not, the South Korea agreement was not canceled. This time, there's no Gary Cohn. This time, Trump is signing executive orders, and with some delays and pauses, some hiccups, he is doing what he said he would do. He was doing what his vice president said he would do. And the incompetence here is on the part of Trump's backers, who are foolish enough to believe he didn't mean it and wouldn't do it. He's meant it, he's doing it, and the results are, as we see, disaster. But disaster is not quite the same thing as chaos. This is Trump's getting the outcome he wanted, not the results he wanted, but that's because the ideas are stupid, not because the execution is imperfect.
Well said. That's an interesting insight. If you permit me, I'd like to ask a bit of an insider question. Most of Trump's appointments have gone through the Senate process pretty smoothly, even in instances where it seems self-evident the individuals were unqualified. Elbridge Colby, who was to be second or third in command in Department of Defense, his nomination, by contrast, has experienced some resistance, including from Republicans. What are we to make of that, David? What does it tell us about the Trump administration's agenda and support for it or lack of support for it in parts of the Republican Senate caucus?
You know, that is such an interesting question. I've pondered it. I don't know that I have a ready answer for you, but let me, for those who have never heard of him, let me just put in some background. So Elbridge Colby is the son of William Colby, son or grandson, who was director of the CIA in the 1960s. And he's a Harvard graduate. He's a very, very establishment person.
Yes.
And he's been hanging around the Washington policy world for a long time, where he's been positioning himself as a China hawk. And that is very suspicious of Chinese intentions, calling for a big increase in American confrontation to China. But in order to ingratiate himself with the Trump team, he's also become a big Ukraine dove. And because he's quite intelligent, he's able to write articles that are completely grammatical and full of English words that say, by selling out Ukraine, you will make the United States in a stronger position against China. Now, as I say, it's grammatical, it's full of English words, it's nonsense, but it's not grammatical nonsense the way you get from some of the other less presentable Trump people. And he's in line for a second or tertiary level appointment in the Department of Defense. And there's been opposition. And I find it baffling. I mean, if you've accepted putting anti-vax crackpot Robert Kennedy in charge of the anti-measles strategy, and we are having measles deaths, if you put Russia apologist Tulsi Gabbard at the head of the National Intelligence Agency, the director of national intelligence, if you have Donald Trump, friend of Russia, and J.D. Vance, even bigger friend of Russia, as president and vice president, why strain at Elbridge Colby in this tertiary position? Why is this an issue? So part of it, I'm guessing maybe a personality issue. He has given offense to Senator Tom Cotton, who seems to be the senator who's put a hold on this.
Yes.
Part of it, maybe it seems like a safer way to register an objection to the pro-Russia tilt of Trump's strategy than opposing it. But it doesn't seem a very purposeful activity because, look, it's not that the fox is inside the chicken house. The fox is inside the chicken house, and the chickens are all dead already. There are a couple that are cowering in the corner, hoping to live a little bit longer, but most of the chickens are dead. And so now, the fox's assistant is here. Like, I don't get it. I don't get it.
Yeah.
I think
Perplexing.
it must be about personalities.
Another thing that's perplexing for a lot of our Canadian listeners and viewers, David, is the preoccupation with Canada. I was speaking to a well-placed American conservative political and policy observer yesterday who said to me that in most circumstances, one can discern the causal source of Donald Trump's preoccupation. Someone says something on Fox and Friends, or Tucker Carlson says something on his YouTube show. But this case of Canada, it's harder to discern
Yeah.
why the president has spent so much of his time focused not just on tariffs, but these escalating threats of annexation and absorbing Canada as the 51st state. Are you able to shed any light on where you think that's coming from and why the president has dedicated such disproportionate time to these questions so early in his presidency?
Well, let me give you some guesses. So first, I have an article in The Atlantic on Wednesday that it was an answer to those who tried to look for large strategic visions in
Yes.
foreign policy. It's malice, it's animus, it's ignorance. The Trump people will say, well, we're trying to put together a big coalition against China. They've slapped Australia with all kinds of tariffs, and Australia is, along with Japan, maybe your most important partner in the Indo-Pacific for confronting China. The idea you would antagonize Australia. So the things that Trump apologists in academia and public life say are not really explanations because they don't line up with the behavior. I think, and in Canada, they don't even try because it seems so crazy.
Yes.
A couple of things may be going on. First, remember that scene at one of the G7 meetings, I think in England in 2018, where Justin Trudeau was caught on a mic making
Yes.
jokes about Trump to Johnson and Macron. Johnson and
Yes.
Macron were laughing, but it was Trudeau who was making the jokes.
Yes.
Not impossible that has been rankling with Trump ever since. It's also true that on certain parts of the American hard right, annexation of Canada has been a dream for a long time. Tucker Carlson has often talked about annexing Canada. Pat Buchanan, back in the 90s, talked about annexing Canada.
Yes.
Because, to put this bluntly, they haven't been keeping up with Canadian demographics, and they see Canada as a strategic reserve of white people. And a way to balance the browning of America from Southern immigration is to annex Canada, and you bring in more white people. Now, the idea that Canada is no more white than the United States is, they haven't quite kept up with that news. But that's a big part, I think, of what is going on. It's about racial rebalancing, and that and there's a complete lack of interest in Canada as Canadians, because if you say, I mean, look, the whole thing is so demented. It feels, again, to quote something different, the whole thing, it's too ugly to make a joke about, but it's too stupid to talk seriously about it. But they have to understand, if you did somehow pull Canada or parts of Canada, the United States, unless you're going to rule them as subjugated territories, which doesn't seem very plausible, they have to have senators, they have to have members of the House, and they will all be Democrats, and they'll all vote to convict Donald Trump at his next impeachment trial. So how does this make any sense? But if you understand it as an expression not of a plan, but of deep animus and of this racial fantasy, I think you're on your way to understanding something.
Well, you mentioned Australia in your answer, David. I want to take up what we've seen out of the administration towards Australia in recent days, and why you think it's important to understanding the inherent limits of the Trump administration's foreign policy when it comes to building a broader coalition to ultimately confront China.
Well, compare Canada and Australia in this way. Canada is bound to the United States no matter what.
Yes.
Nobody's away. Australia is very far away from the United States. Australia now does almost 4 times as much trade with China as it does with the United States.
Yes.
And China is really no kind of is very far away from Australia too, so it's no kind of direct strategic threat. So one of the things you would worry about if you're a big strategic thinker is, will there be drift? will Australia be pulled gradually into the Chinese orbit as their
Yes.
most important customer and as a supplier of capital and away from the United States? And against that, you would say, okay, well, maybe they're bound to China by ties of trade. But with the United States, they're ties of history, they're ties of values. And so your message would be, well, let's accentuate the ties of history and values. Let's emphasize these shared, the things that we share to compensate for the increasing gravity of the economic pull to China. What Trump has done is say, no, we're not going to do that. Instead, what we're going to do is sever even more the economic links between the United States and Australia.
Yes.
They do nearly 4 times as much business as China's with us. Let's make it 5 times and see what happens then. And it just seems reckless at the same time as they're alienating Japan. The Japanese prime minister came to the United States during the Biden administration, gave a speech to a joint session of Congress in which he talked about how the defense of Ukraine is important to Japanese security.
Hmm.
The Japanese do not agree with the theory that by jettisoning Ukraine, you somehow make the United States more credible vis-a-vis China. He explicitly
Yes.
said the opposite. And Japan has been a generous supporter of aid to Ukraine because they see security is indivisible. But the Japanese are going to be put off too. The South Koreans are worried by Trump's enthusiasm for North Korea. So
Yes.
in every area of the globe, what Trump is doing is dissolving historic bonds. And it looks often like the only allies he wants are Russia, Saudi Arabia, and El Salvador.
Yeah. If I could just say in parentheses, David, one thing that has struck me is the inherent dissonance between the Trump administration's self-image as a populist nationalist movement and its inattention to nationalist sentiments within the countries that it's antagonizing. It seems to me that there's a sense that countries like Canada will go through some type of rigid cost-benefit analysis and come out the other side with
Yeah.
the decision that notwithstanding these provocations, it's still in Canada's interest to be part of the American orbit. And that strikes me as a pretty big risk, given the rise of nationalism in Canada and in many of the other countries that you've mentioned.
And that's not their worst miscalculation. Their worst miscalculation is the one they're making in Mexico. And that is one that could be really costly, where there are people in the Trump world who are thinking, we are going to fly drones equipped with missiles over Mexican territory, and we are going to hunt and kill fentanyl merchants in Mexico, with or without the consent of the Mexican government. And the Mexican cartels are not going to retaliate in any way at all inside American cities. One of the big Trump talking points is they want to declare the cartels international organizations.
Yes.
And in some ways they qualify. Understand that doing this is a step toward the militarization of the campaign against the cartels, and not only militarization, but the Americanization of the militarization of the campaign against the cartels.
Yes.
The cartels have gone very far to the way to avoid direct confrontations with the United States because they're afraid of what the Americans would respond. But if the Americans lead with a militarized campaign inside Mexico against the cartels have considerable retaliatory capacity. You could find yourself with a criminal terrorist insurgency inside the southern United States. Bombs going off in shopping malls. And I don't think the Trump people think about this at all.
Yeah, the designation of cartels has been one of the, as terrorist organizations, has been one of the demands that the administration has made of Canada, which is a good segue to a question I wanted to put to you about Canada's response in recent days. No doubt, David, you saw the threat by Ontario's Ford government of shutting down or reducing electricity exports to the United States. That decision has been paused in recent days in exchange for a meeting next week, I guess, between our federal finance minister, Dominic LeBlanc, and Ontario Premier Doug Ford. What are you to make of that episode? And more broadly, David, as a Canadian, someone who's followed Canadian policy and politics closely for a long time, what do you make of the increasing role that provincial premiers and provincial governments are playing in these interactions with the Trump administration? Is that a good thing or a bad thing in your mind?
Well, I think the provincial presence is a little bit of an inevitable reaction to the Canadian electoral cycle.
Yes.
Which is there isn't really a federal government right now. There hasn't been
Yes.
since the beginning of the year, and there won't be for another 6 or 8 weeks. So in the absence of a functioning federal government that's not in electioneering mode, the provinces step up. I think there's also something quite elegant about the Ford move, because it's a kind of a 1-2 punch. I looked it up the other day. Ontario's electricity exports to the United States are dwarfed by Quebec's. Quebec is the big exporter, not Ontario. When you hear Rob Ford say, or when you hear people say that Ontario exports could affect as many as 1.5 million households in Wisconsin and New York and Michigan, you know what? That sounds like a big number. It's not. So the Ontario threat is a demonstration of that. Then
Mm.
the role of nickels in the glove is the unstated threat. Quebec could do the same thing, could apply the export tax, and that would really hurt. That would really hurt, and that hurts not a ring of states around, not 1 million households in 3 or 4 states around the Great Lakes, but that would affect millions upon millions of households in New York and New England, where they are a giant exporter.
Yes.
And that's, by the way, what is so demented about this whole aluminum threat. Aluminum is just congealed electricity. And the reason Canada has an advantage in aluminum is because of the abundance of hydropower in the province of Quebec. That's not something that is going to change with tariffs. All that's going to happen is you tariff Canadian aluminum, you raise the price of American aircraft. You raise the price of American aircraft, you raise the price of American airline fares. You raise the price of American airline fares, you raise the cost of doing business in every, there's this whole house that Jack built problem with protectionism. You
Yeah.
can't just raise one price, you raise every other price through the whole economy.
Well said.
One of the things that is so weird about the Trump administration is it's dominated by all these tech bros who grew up reading Ayn Rand, and then they get to power and they act like the villains, not the heroes in an Ayn Rand novel.
That, I think, David, is our title for today's episode. You mentioned Canada's political dynamic, and I have to ask you, since we last spoke,
Yeah.
Mark Carney won a decisive victory in the Liberal Party leadership race, and all things being equal, will be sworn in as Prime Minister before we speak next week. What do you make of Carney's victory and ascendancy to the prime minister role, even if it's temporary before we have a forthcoming election? And what should we expect in your mind from a Prime Minister, Mark Carney?
I'm going to do a little bit of an I told you so lap on this one. So back before Trump was elected, and we were talking more about strictly domestic Canadian politics, one of the warnings I sounded again and again was that it was very dangerous for an opposition party to do too much to define itself in a Westminster system. Very much dangerous to define itself too much, too far in advance of the election, because you don't know what the issues are going to be. So all the definition will be is a liability to, or a potential liability, and very unlikely to be an asset, because the success of an opposition party really is contingent on the failure of a government. And so we've seen in Canada where the Conservative Party became convinced that populist politics was the wave of the future, took on a series of stances that seemed to play well in the context of the aftermath of COVID, supported the trucker boycott, the trucker seizure of Ottawa, and built a brand identity. And then Trump wins, and Trump starts threatening Canada. And that brand identity is now nothing but a liability. And it was completely unnecessary, because had they just not committed themselves in this way, today they would be ready with the issues that are going to be the voting issues of 2025 to take stances on how to defend Canada against the economic and other threats from the United States. And the huge move in the polls is a product of the strange thing where the Liberals, the people who've been in power since 2015, got to present themselves as something new.
Yes.
Whereas the out party, the opposition party that should be the something new, is stuck with a brand identity forged under completely different circumstances in 2021 that is now a big liability in 2025.
Yeah, well said. The ballot question has fundamentally shifted, as you say, and the Conservatives are struggling to find their voice on the singular issue that will ultimately decide the forthcoming election, which is really about which party is best positioned to protect Canadian interests vis-a-vis the Trump administration.
And I want to say, Canada First is a bad answer to the slogan America First, because it's not it says we're the same people just across the line. And that the point of what is wrong with America First is not that that every other country should also seek to be first. What's wrong with that slogan is that what we've all learned since the Depression and the Second World War and through the Reconstruction afterwards is the way you protect democratic values is by collaborating with your fellow democracies. America First is a bad slogan because it means America alone. And Canada First is an even worse slogan because it means Canada alone. And Canada can afford to be that even less. That the answer to what Donald Trump is doing is to reaffirm the importance of free trade, collective security, the alliance of the democracies. And you can get off on a really wrong foot by saying we want to be chauvinists for a smaller nation.
I want to ask you the question in the aftermath of Carney's leadership win. A pollster in Canada tweeted something. I'm paraphrasing, but something like the next election will be decided by which party could present itself as more persuasively anti-Trump and anti-American. What do you think of that characterization, and what in your mind are the risks with an election campaign that has the different parties trying to outcompete themselves to who can be more anti-American than the other?
Is 50% of passing or a failing grade on an answer? Because that's 50% right. And if for sure the parties need to be non-Trump. You know, it's not even 50% right, because the point is not to be anti-Trump. The point is to be not Trump. And the point is also, Canadians are not anti-American. Canadians want to get back to the America they know and admired and respected and did business with, the America that's a partner. And so the job of the next Prime Minister of Canada is to show, I know how to navigate past today's crisis in a way that doesn't make this problem worse, but makes it better. Trump and I remember what America was. I believe in what America could be and will be again. I have a plan to get us from here to there. I absolutely will defend Canadian interests, and Doug Ford has been doing this very effectively. When if they tariff the steel, we put taxes on their electricity. We hit tit for tat, but always, and this is the thing that Doug Ford has done so well, always with a goal toward the restoration of trade peace. That we're not here to win this trade war, which of course Canada cannot possibly do.
Yes.
We're here to mobilize enough awareness in the United States of what a folly this Trump project is for people on both sides of the border. And it will hurt Canada more, it always will, but it will hurt Americans too. And it's unnecessary and stupid and is poisoning America's relationships with other allies like Australia that they also need. So the goal isn't to be anti. The goal is to be in favor of the ideals of democratic defense, in favor of the ideals of global cooperation, in favor of the ideals of free trade. That's why Ukraine is such an important issue beyond the importance of Ukraine itself, is it symbolizes the unity and cooperativeness of the Western democracies. And that's why Trump hates Ukraine so much.
It's careful, David. That's a message I could vote for and get excited about. But I just want to wrap up with one final question, because this will probably be the last time we speak before Prime Minister Justin Trudeau exits the political stage. We talked a bit about his legacy when he first announced that he would resign in January, but why don't I just ask you to reflect a bit on Prime Minister Trudeau's legacy and what the lessons you think are for both the Liberal Party and Canadian politicians more generally?
Well, bad fiscal management can be corrected by better fiscal management. But there are two things that Trudeau is leaving for the long term. One is the underperformance of Canadian productivity. He just never took that on, or maybe he didn't have ideas about how to do it. And as we said before, his idea was, if you admit lots of immigrants, that you can make up with by adding more factors of production for the failure to improve the efficiency of the factors of production you have. Extensive, not intensive growth. So that's one of his legacies, is the failure to grapple with Canada's most important economic problem. And the second has been his validation of this attack on the country's identity. And these slurs on its history, these slurs on its character. And I think Trump is reminding Canadians of what they're proud of. And this contradiction should cast an even worse retrospective shadow on the defamation of Canadian history and the builders of Canada that was such a part of the Justin Trudeau government's ideological message. It wasn't something they intended, I think. They just got drawn into it, but they never had the character and strength of will to say, no, we're not, we're certainly going to compensate people who are harmed in the residential schools. The Harper government did that, and if more compensation is called for, but we're not going to engage in this national self-destruction, this national self-libel. And that, I think, that may not be enduring because I think Trump is fixing that problem very fast, but it's a legacy. It's not a good one.
David, man, we covered a lot of issues and topics in this conversation. I want to thank you for joining me, and as importantly, I want to thank you for agreeing to extend these conversations on a weekly basis over the next few months, which are no doubt going to be involve a lot of turmoil both domestically and globally. Thanks for taking the time to speak with me, and I look forward to catching up in a couple of weeks.
See you next week. Bye-bye.